Our man, Frank Seravalli, has been patiently waiting for us. He joins us on this Friday afternoon. Frank, a question that we're going to ask in our Anyone Else segment, and oh my gosh, the USA shirt, of course. You know we're big Sweden guys over here, right? We're big Sweden fans in Vancouver.
You didn't happen to be in the neighborhood of Prudential Center this afternoon, did you, man? Can you just swing by the Rock and get us some line combos, Frank?
It's funny, JPat, as you said that, I was like, man, had I known, I would have just gone up there today.
Oh yeah, well,
it's only about an hour from my house.
That always, anyways, we're not going to start talking about U.S. geography because I find it very interesting how you can drive almost. How far is New York for you? Sorry, now I'm asking questions.
Well, yeah, New York City is just on the other side of the Rock, so 10 minutes from there, maybe with traffic, crazy. Probably 25, 30.
But
it's like I think it's like 3 or 4 miles. That's it.
Yeah. The hell's a mile?
Yeah, that's.
Anyways,
go USA.
Yeah, yes, go USA. Yeah.
I thought you were going to blow us kisses.
Frank, okay, so like I was saying, the conversation that we're having on this show is when will the Canucks make a trade? Because all of the experiments in the top 6 seem like they've lost their shine.
Isn't that just the nature of an 82-game season? I mean, at some point, even the best players, Connor McDavid, Elias Pettersson, whoever it might be, Quinn Hughes, they hit a rough patch. So if the best players in the world are doing it, then at some point, the guys that are a couple notches down are going to fall into the same trap. In terms of experiments, I think there's none bigger than, exactly what's happening right now with Kuzmenko. When you look at where the Canucks are at in terms of cap and consequences with that, in terms of what other deadline moves they might be able to make, it'd be so nice to have a ready-made solution in-house that you don't have to go out and get, that you could maybe fill another void instead. And so I'd love to see Kuzmenko get another crack at it and see if he can sort of fall in line with what the coaching staff is looking for, because that's been one of the real head scratchers this season, is how a player that was that good last year, that created that much chemistry and is clearly a successful tool on the power play, hasn't been able to get going this year.
It's 5 healthy scratches now before the midway mark. And you just wonder, like the first couple were message sending. This one, it feels like an exasperated head coach, that the message isn't getting through and that he's not liking what he's seeing. And so 39 goals last year, an absolute heater of a shooting percentage. I think we all thought that there would be some sort of a step back, but for him to now be at 8 goals at the midway mark, essentially, a distressed asset, obviously. But do you think would there be interest in the player? Obviously, 5.5. It's not easy to fit under a salary cap for all teams. But what would teams around the NHL, would they see the 39 goal scorer, or are they looking at a guy that right now is having trouble fitting in with a coach in this kind of system?
I think they're probably way more likely to see, if they're acquiring him, the 39 goal scorer, at least somewhere in the middle, that maybe he doesn't quite get back to the level that he was at last year, although I wouldn't count it out, that maybe he's somewhere in between, that he could be a useful tool. And at $5.5 million, that's really all you're asking for, isn't it? Like, it's not, it's not 11.2, it's not 8, it's 5.5. That's kind of what a mid-range forward, middle 6 forward should be getting in today's NHL, provided that they're able to produce. And I'd love to know, really, I'd love to inject some truth serum into Rick Tocchet and really get the answer of, what exactly is it that he's looking for that he's not getting so far this year from Kuzmenko.
He always talks about, the plays at both blue lines and not hustling back enough and not getting in on the forecheck, but it really seems to be sort of the high danger spinorama stuff at the blue line, turning pucks over. That's what he has repeatedly talked about when people have asked him. You'd think that a player at some point, you could get that out of your game, because Tocchet said, 2 weeks ago, he said, if you're one-on-one with a guy, you want to do your spinorama there down low in the offensive zone. I think he said, have a party. It was the line that he used. But he's seeing too much of that in the neutral zone and at the blue line, and pucks are being turned over and going the other way. So I do think that some of this has to be on Kuzmenko, and it can't be lost in translation. They've got other Russians in the locker room. They've got Sergei Gonchar on the staff. So it's not about the message getting through. It kind of feels now like a battle of wills between the player and the coach, and that rarely works out well for the player.
Yeah, it never ends well. But here's the thing I'll say, and look, full marks to Rick Tocchet for what he's done this year, the structure that they've put in place, the way that this team has played and has been consistently good almost the entire season. A lot of that, when you talk to the Canucks front office, they give that credit to the coach. But to me, the way that Kuzmenko, is right now, the spot that he's in, to me is a failure more on the coaching staff than it is the player. And the reason for that is you have to be able to bend a little bit. And that works both ways. Kuzmenko has to be able to bend a little bit, but same thing with Rick Tocchet. And as a coach, I think about this a lot. It's not nearly on the same scale, but when I coach, I feel like I judge myself based on the strides that the players at the bottom of my lineup make over the course of a season. And you have to harness what the player does really exceptionally well. And for Kuzmenko, that's being a productive, creative, offensive player. And you have to find a way to not choke that out. And to his point, he said, offensive zone, go have a party. But you have to be willing to take some of the flaws that a player has and be able to work with them. And I don't know that 5 healthy scratches through the first 40 games of the year is something that makes a lot of sense for someone that is really obviously talented and still has some term. It's not like, they can just kind of dispatch him at the end of this year. He's not going anywhere unless you find a way to trade him at this deadline. And in some ways, I feel like based on the way he played last year, it might be selling at his lowest value point.
Well, that's for sure. Yeah, like there's talk of selling him at the last deadline. Think of the cap hit he was on last year when he was on pace to score 40 goals at that point. And Frank, that point you just brought up, I find it really interesting because it's something I've tried to give a lot of thought to. And I look back at what we've seen with Dakota Joshua, Nils Höglander, and the thing that Rick Tocchet always says when he speaks about these kind of players and the situations surrounding them is meet me in the middle. That's what he likes to say is meet me in the middle. I'll do this. You do this. And Jeff, I guess this is a question for you as well that we can kind of all three of us talk about is what does meeting Andrei Kuzmenko in the middle really look like? Because Tocchet has his non-negotiables, Frank. Like when he got hired here, he said, I have the non-negotiables. And for guys like JT Miller, for example, JT Miller was somebody that had to start respecting those non-negotiables about back checking, hustling to the bench for changes, all that sort of stuff. So we know Rick Tocchet's not going to give on any of his non-negotiables. But I mean, Jeff, I'll ask you, and Frank, you as well chime in. But like, what does it look like for Rick Tocchet to meet Andrei Kuzmenko in the middle?
I think Frank mentioned the fact that there has to be some flexibility here, that it's not equal across the board for everybody. I think you have to work with players, find their strengths, try to eliminate some of their weaknesses. And for Kuzmenko, obviously, there are still questions about the forecheck. And I thought Tocchet's been so good in terms of explaining his thought process. And he went deep a couple of weeks back, too, when he said that one of the problems with Kuzmenko is when they need him to be the first guy in on the forecheck, he's so reluctant. And that is causing issues for the second guy because he doesn't know where Kuzmenko is going to be on the ice. And, they've got structure. They've got places that they're supposed to be based on the reads that they're making. And so I just thought, okay, I mean, that's a great explanation that, people can say, oh, he's not back checking, but what are the issues on the forecheck? Well, it's not just that he's not getting on his horse and getting in. He's not a physical guy. I think he has 2 hits on the season, but you can still positionally forecheck and angle guys and force them into places they don't want to be. But if you're reluctant, then the trickle down is your teammates don't know where to go and everything kind of gets out of whack there. So I do think that, Rick Tocchet's got to, again, work with this player. I think they've done some of that, but if it's the fact that the things that they're trying to get out of his game aren't coming out of his game, I said last night, Frank, if he can't play in game 38 in St. Louis, like, what are the chances that he's going to be able to play effectively in Tocchet's system in the playoffs? And the Canucks are headed to the playoffs. So I do think it's time to start looking at some of these things through a playoff prism.
I don't think you're ever going to eliminate some of those things. You can try and work with a player. The thing is, you have to be willing to accept or not. And if you're not, then you have to cut bait. That's really the thing. at this age, Kuzmenko as a player is what he is. He's probably not changing a whole heck of a lot. He could do some little things differently and maybe try to get closer to meeting Tocchet in the middle, but you are what you are most of the time.
That's really interesting. And again, we just keep coming back to the timeline, right? Like Rick Tocchet coached Kuzmenko for one game before that extension. And Don Taylor was pointing this out on Donnie and Dolly this morning. That game was the game where Kuzmenko scored 2 goals in Chicago and was player of the game. So if Rick Tocchet's asked the next day, hey, what do you think? We're thinking of extending this guy. Yeah, for sure.
Nothing anybody did against Chicago last year should have been used as any sort of barometer. I think I scored 3 goals against the Blackhawks last season, if I'm not mistaken.
Not only that, but these extensions don't come together that quickly. It was probably weeks in the making before Tocchet was even there, and it was long since done by the time he arrived.
And that's another thing. And I mean, again, truth serum.
That's been the MO of the Canucks front office, though, is doing things out of order at times that has really, I think, hurt their process over the last 5 years.
What are some other examples of that you'd point to?
The fact that Francesco Aquilini hired Bruce Boudreau before hiring the GM and president of Hockey Ops. I mean, it set them back a year and a half.
Yeah, but they're heading down that road again, trying to make big picture organizational decisions without Elias Pettersson, locked and loaded here. Like, they're going to have to make decisions ahead of the trade deadline on players. Philip Hronek's going to get, like, in a perfect world, you get Pettersson done, you'd have Hronek, and you'd know exactly where all those are slotted. And yet they're going to have to make some big time decisions with the uncertainty of the financials on some of those key contracts.
I'm not entirely sold that is all going to come to pass. Like, I'm not making any projections or predictions, but I wouldn't be shocked if they could really push to get Pettersson done before the deadline.
Well, it would certainly make life easier on a couple of fronts. It would give them certainty. They'd know that their star player was here and going to be here for a while, because they do have some decisions. They got so many unrestricted free agents or pending UFAs that they're not all coming back, but I do think they have some that they want to re-up. But every dollar matters in the cap, even with the cap going up. But you got the OEL contract on the books here, and so we'll see where all of that goes. But I mean, that's best case scenario for them. And I know that sort of the same hope with Nylander in Toronto, that the All-Star game kind of feels like it's an artificial deadline, but it also feels like it's there. We're now within a month of it. And somebody made the great point yesterday, like, I don't know if Elias Pettersson is going to go to the All-Star game. They've got so many candidates and it's a numbers game, but can you imagine him, Frank, sitting there front and center on media day, just like bombarded with questions about his contract? Like, he doesn't want any part of that.
Yes, I can.
Frank, just before we close out here, I want to ask you this question because, like, again, I know off the top, I asked you, when will the Canucks make a trade? And that's kind of the topic we're focusing on. There's so many factors. There's the fact that the Canucks have built themselves a cushion that they don't need to make any sort of panic move, whether we want them to or not. They don't need to make a trade immediately, but with Jim Rutherford teams of the past, and hell, even Jim Rutherford Canucks teams, like, they traded Bo Horvat before the All-Star break last year. Do you expect the Canucks, and hey, one of the factors that might suggest that they're going to wait a bit is the Elias Pettersson contract extension. Do you expect them to be active long before the deadline like we've seen Jim Rutherford teams in years past do? Or do you think we're going to see more action on deadline day and in the days leading right up to the deadline?
I think they're going to try and be more active ahead of time. I think part of the issue is, and I was talking about this with an NHL player yesterday who goes, I don't really understand this league. The way he explained it, he said, there's 22 good teams, there's 5 god-awful teams, and 5 elite teams. And he said the 22 that are in that mix are not really entirely crystallized, some more than others, but aren't really crystallized in terms of which way they're thinking, which way they're heading. And this is a player that actually wants to try and get moved. And he was saying, I'm having a hard time getting out of here because the response from a bunch of teams that may potentially could be interested in me, well, they just don't know exactly yet what their posture is when it comes to the trade deadline. I think that's part of it. Has been a big sort of, wrench in some teams' plans of, what's going on with Pittsburgh and Washington, and what happens with some of the teams that are in the murky middle in the West, the Nashvilles, the St. Louis's, that group that could kind of maybe be playoff teams, but are also, have the real potential to be passed by Edmonton and Minnesota, or maybe even in Arizona, for instance. So look, that part has been tough to sort out. Here's what I'll say, and you guys are way more interested in at least Quads, you are, the timeline. I'm not so much interested in the timeline in Vancouver, more so the fit, because to me, that's been the one hallmark in Jim Rutherford's career. Well, there's actually two when it comes to trades. One is when he has made a mistake, or there's been a mistake on his roster, something that he can't live with, he's really good at cutting bait. There's no emotion involved. It's just like, hey, we got to make a move. We got to get this guy out of here. Can't have this linger. And so you've gotten a slight taste of that with like the Tanner Pearson trade, or maybe even the Dickinson trade. And he's been able to just say, you know what, this might suck in the meantime, but we have to do this. So that's one. And the second one, which I think is way more fun to think about, is he seems to have the golden touch when it comes to taking a really good team and adding some completing or finishing pieces, complementary pieces, if you will, to it. And I think back to the number of deadlines that he had, not just in Pittsburgh, but also in Carolina, that he found someone that put those teams over the top. Trevor Daley on the back end, Ron Hainsey, like just guys that even at the time I was like, Trevor Daley, he looks half dead. Were you watching him in Chicago? Like I was like, I can't believe that they think that's the guy to go out and get. And he comes in and he's outstanding for the Penguins and becomes a guy that's immensely popular among his teammates. And Hainsey comes in and he was great. So like you think of those guys that Rutherford's been able to add, and I'm like, that's what he's really good at. I don't know that it's necessarily building from scratch, but the nice thing in Van is he didn't really have to do that. There were some pieces there. Working alongside Patrik Allvin, he's had to cut out a bunch, some bad contracts and some leftover things from the Benning era. But by and large, that's where he's, made his pile of money and Stanley Cup rings, is right around the trade deadline, trying to find fits.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at that Hurricanes team, right? Like that's the one that I think we're going to focus on a lot. When they went out and got Doug Wade, especially, like that was early too. Like that was early, and that's kind of going to be the focus of or anyone else segment, which I can't wait to get to because I want them to make a trade tomorrow, Frank. Frank,
let me tell you this, Quads. Yeah. It's not all about you.
Oh, come on now.
The
millennials. I'm not even a millennial. I'm Gen Z.
Even
worse.
I was gonna say.
Frank, thanks so much for doing this. Enjoy your weekend. Thanks so much.
I am the silver-haired millennial.
And the gold medal World Junior winner.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Frank.
Guys.
All right,
See ya.
Frank.
Canucks Conversation with Harmon and Quads every weekday at 2 p.m. Be sure to check it out on the Canucks Army YouTube channel. And if you missed it, go check it out on your favorite podcast catcher app.